we go again. Because there is plenty to unpack going into this weekend, since we've just come away from a race weekend. And we're not just talking about the championship, we're talking about RBR Day, which is any time after the Mexico City Grand Prix. As we have heard, this weekend will be the decider in regards to who goes where within the Red Bull fold. Does Isaac Hadjar ultimately get the call up to Red Bull for 2026? Does Yuki Tsunoda miraculously survive into the following year despite Honda moving on and Ford coming in? But one thing is safe to say is that the decision is not nearly as clear-cut as it was back in the summer when we all thought, oh well, Hadjar's going up next to Max Verstappen guaranteed. Now though, it's certainly looking a lot more cloudy, and I can honestly say that going into this weekend, I'm really not sure what's going to happen. The Maeke's era has really brought up justification for all kinds of scenarios, and you feel like, even with Helmut Marko breathing down his neck, whatever decision the team come up with is going to be a lot more rational than it would have been during the Horner era, where it would have just been, we're just gonna give Isaac a go and just see what happens for the best. Oh, if he's not good, oh well, we got plenty of drivers, just give them a go too. No, none of that. You feel like there'll be an essay as to why a person isn't picked for that particular role. And in the case of Tsunoda, last weekend was a great boost for his own campaign, and his demeanour exuded calmness despite the impending decision, and the storm in the teacup situation regarding Oliver Bearman, and the overtake that never was. Say what you will about the particular incident, they did not make contact. Yes, Yuki did twitch going into braking, but at the same time, there was not really that much room to be had for Bearman to actually make the turn without going off into the dirt, and as we saw, he went off, he was denied an opportunity for P7, and we found out about how annoyed Bearman was afterwards. Him saying that Yuki's a dangerous driver and he should be not in the sport. Sorry, Bearman. This would be a lot more compelling if you hadn't been to the steward's office so often this season, and you got 10 penalty points for your trouble. I mean, we all kept raving about Max Verstappen being near a race ban, so why shouldn't we be saying the same thing about Bearman being only 2 penalty points away from the same transgression? And this off of the back of Bearman getting a 10-second penalty in the sprint, which denied him scoring a point there. But we're all wondering what Tsunoda's going to say in response, because he has been a firecracker in the past, and we all expect expletives, but instead we got nothing. Just a bemused look, indifference you could say, and probably an internal wondering of, where am I going to find some good barbecue in Austin after this race? To celebrate a P7, which was a really handy result for him, as well as his fight back from 18th to 7th in the sprint itself. And it just made me think that Yuki has really come on leaps and bounds since that dive bomb in Bahrain against Daniel Ricciardo, and I think the Australian really gave him some good life lessons in just trying to regulate himself in tense situations, because you got to remember with Tsunoda and Ricciardo, they were very much fighting for that prize next to Verstappen themselves. But Oliver, come on, you had a solid weekend in scoring points at Haas's home race, just let it go. This isn't it. And in the midst of that Red Bull decision, there's going to be plenty of FP1 action as we've seen in previous seasons. With Dunn out at McLaren, it's expected that Pato O'Ward will step up to the plate in front of the home crowd. Lindblad and Iwasa are going to be in Red Bull-backed machines. World Endurance driver for Ferrari and development F1 driver Antonio Fuoco is going to be racing the SF25 in place of Hamilton. Jack Crawford's going to get an opportunity to be in Aston Martin. I think he's taking Lance's car because Felipe Drugovich has moved on to pastures new in Formula E. And one particular tidbit, which I did find quite curious, is that Paul Aron over at Alpine is going to be taking Pierre Gasly's car. So that means there can be a live barometer comparison between himself and Colapinto, because as the team has said, if there's anyone going to be in that second seat, it's either going to be Franco or it's going to be Paul. We've heard many times before that they've been competing against one another in private tests that Alpine have conducted, so this is the first time I think we're actually going to be seeing representative comparisons before our very special eyes. And that is the perfect springboard for us to talk about that particular incident, the one that Formula One could not get enough of and has been very much a talking point amongst many of the English-speaking creatives, and many of them starting to go, you know what? That Franco's got guts. It was very much big news, and Colapinto did endear himself with many Formula One fans for his actions. The consensus being that that in that particular scenario, he was right to ignore the order. Had this been a scenario where this had been, say, fighting for 9th and 10th, and Franco was 10th, Gasly was 9th, Bortoleto was steaming up right behind them, threatening to take a spot, Colapinto with the fresher tyres would have been more able to defend, thusly making sure that Alpine scored 3 points, instead of Franco just going for it, taking 9th place, Gasly being left like a sitting duck, and then falling behind Bortoleto, and only one of the Alpines would have scored. If it had been that particular context, I would then say what Steve Nielsen said about it being disappointing in an internal review. Okay, that would be somewhat valid. But this was the debate as to who was going to be third to last of the classified finishers. This is not applicable here. So in this particular situation, I, and many people across the world, are with Franco. As he said to the press, there's no point arguing about these things, and what is even more interesting here is that Pierre himself was in agreement. Sure, the Frenchman was probably taken aback by the flattening of orders at the time, and it meant that Bortoleto overtook him, but the Frenchman's take is that indeed, there are bigger fish to fry within the team, so there is little point to finger point in matters like this. Him saying, we have many things to review as a team, and the main problem is that we are just too slow. Indeed, you are right, Pierre. Your team is too slow. And I think the situation of who is going to get 17th is the least of their worries right now. And you're going to be going to the Mexico City Grand Prix, where it's a power circuit, it's down a long straight, it's up in thin air, where the engines are going to be even more anemic than they would have been in lower climbs, and that Renault engine, yeesh, it's going to be a painful weekend for anyone working in Inston. And for Nielsen, I think this was probably a very big blow, and I don't think Briatore would really like this, because he'd be saying, you couldn't keep regularly sick, you had to dig in. Let's just say that Steve's job might be on the line here, because they have not got a very strong pit wall at all over at Alpine. With that order being ignored, it made them look powerless to lay down the law strongly enough to deter Colapinto from yet again holding position. That isn't the first time this has happened this year, and it was probably one time too many for the Argentinian, because as has been discussed, a similar situation happened where holding position and team orders meant that Colapinto was denied an opportunity for his first points of the year, albeit 1 point, but 1 point might have been enough to secure him 2026. But okay, I'll stop here for now because we've got plenty of other things to talk about and we are meant to be predicting this weekend's race, but do let me know in the comments if you'd like me to expand this into a dedicated video, and maybe even like the video, or subscribe for when it drops. You'll find out as soon as I'm getting round to it. But yes, we do have to broach that particular topic at least a little bit, and that is the idea that Max Verstappen is coming in hot. Him cutting Piastri's advantage over the Dutchman since the Dutch Grand Prix by nigh on 2/3. And the perception is that Verstappen doesn't see Norris as a particular championship threat. He sees him more like an obstacle between himself and the Australian. And possibly one that he holds with less regard than in previous years, because the look of stunned silence in the cool-down room when Lando Norris wished that Kota would be easier, and then Charles says comedically well-timed, "What?" was the finisher. Charles and Max are on the same page, whereas Lando, he's off reading another book. Because, come on, Max is not thinking about Lando, he is thinking about Piastri, because, as of now, even though the gap between Lando and Oscar is only 14 points, the Australian is in the pound seat. I don't think Max is going to be assuming anything, and he's saying that every weekend has to be perfect for Red Bull for them to even have a sniff of the World Championship. But there might be something which means that it might be that little bit tougher, because Oscar Piastri may be floundering in terms of the results in the last few races since his Dutch Grand Prix win, but he does feel like he's found the problem, and that might be something to do with qualifying. In the second half of the year so far, it's been far less easy for Oscar to finish high up in the qualification standings, pointing it to one clause, pointing to the idea that he feels like he's not clicking with the car over one lap, suggesting that he might have a drop in confidence somewhere along the line, but that it can be improved if he can just dig deep and discover what's going on. Him qualifying on the third row at Austin just proved that he was not able to do the deed on Saturday, and on the Sunday, he wasn't really able to make any ground at all. He was able to get one place higher, and then that was it. And he said that he simply didn't gel well with the car, which is something that tracks because Andrea Stella, the team principal, said so himself, that it was just not a weekend that was favourable for Oscar, like it was last year, where he finished 5th as well. And the second thing that Piastri said in this particular statement is that he has experience in the past in the junior categories when it comes to title battles, some of them being a lot closer than they are at present. I mean, remember, he is a back-to-back champion. He does have experience in situations like these, but to be fair, he is witnessing a mighty push from one of the most tenacious racers of this current crop of drivers, so it would be wrong of me to assume he's totally calm right now. It would freak anyone out. Well, okay, maybe not George, but that's for another season. So for any Piastri fans out there who might be worried about whether or not Oscar is strong enough to take down Max, I feel like this kind of news from the Australian himself will provide you at least a little bit of comfort. That he's at least able to identify the issue and find some way to correct it, and that maybe he doesn't have to resort to team orders to protect him. And in an ideal world for both he and Lando, that would be better, that they can win the championship, without any favours from their teammate or the team providing them. Although it is to be debated that the repercussions that were talked about over the weekend last time out were to do with qualifying priorities. I don't know, the whole idea of him not wanting the team orders might be seen as a little bit naive. He might have to call upon them if Max continues to close in on him and Lando continues to tick upwards, because you do have to remember 2024. Lando remained relatively consistent, whereas Oscar really fell flat, and arguably almost cost McLaren the constructors. But as I will talk about later, I'm not going to be assuming that, he thinks that he's identified the problem and he's going to win the next Grand Prix by 20 seconds. No, that just does not track. That does not make any sense. But at least it might be able to provide him an opportunity to qualify on the front two rows a little bit more consistently. But we'll see that going into the last few races. But okay, on to the track itself. And this track is a very characterful one. Not just with the stadium section, which in of itself is delightfully iconic, the air is thin enough to make wings feel pointless. The 1997 Williams prototype would love it. Yet cars still punch Monza-like speeds because drag collapses and we get ludicrous speeds. It means that we can see a whole lot more variety in terms of the rear wings that the teams and drivers pick. You could maybe have a more grippy rear wing that gets you a little bit more of an advantage in the slow stuff. The penalty going down the straight is not nearly as bad. Or you can just go for broke, like maybe I think Max Verstappen and Red Bull will do, to go for a skinny rear wing, go for the maximum speed, and just do what they did in Italy. But what will be really important is what happens with the engine, the turbochargers, and the cooling. This is a race we always talk about the fins and the holes in the cars, and the more holes you have on your wagon, the more draggy you are going to be, and you are going to be really thinking, I don't want this engine to blow up. And remember, we're near the end of the season, and they are very much running out on dependable engines. We are probably going to be seeing a lot more engine grid penalties in the last few races. And with 3 DRS zones and a main straight which goes on for forever, it's going to be also a test of nerves. It's also had its fair share of drama in the twisty section away from its signature elements, with plenty of barging happening and a lot of technical know-how needed to maybe pounce on drivers within the second DRS area. And you know what? I've really grown to like this track over the years. At first, when we came back in 2015, I wasn't really that interested in it, but as we've actually seen time go on and the drivers really take to it and the coverage has been really detailed, I'm actually finding it quite charming. It's got character, it's got memorable sections. I actually come to this weekend with a little bit of a smile. I'm thinking, that's a really, really cool one. It's just a shame that I'm going to be on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. I really hope there's coverage. I really hope that, because I am not paying for the Wi-Fi package. No, sir. Well, I mean, unless something really controversial happens and I can make my money back on YouTube. I'm just saying. But another thing to consider here is that the tyres are slightly different to what they were last year. Last year we had the C3, C4, C5 for the hard, medium, soft, but we are now seeing a stepped compound experiment again, but thankfully it's not the C1 tyre, which again, I think all the drivers despise and they don't want to touch with a barge pole. Same goes for the C6. Pirelli, you really need to do your homework next year, I swear to God. This weekend, the hard moves one step tougher to the C2 tyre. That skips the compound, and in theory, it should mean that teams might be more willing to do a two-stop. But, as we saw in Austin, teams will do everything in their power to avoid using the hard tyre to mean they only have to do one stop. But, to be fair, the C2 is less punishing time-wise than the C1, so I think it might be a more viable option if people want to try and do something bold with a hard tyre which is not nearly as slow as the C1. And we've got the C4 and C5, it's something I thought would have worked around Austin, but maybe around Mexico, it might be just the ticket. And it means that the C4 tyre, which is typically in Europe the softer tyre, means that it's going to be the workhorse because it's the medium tyre. The medium is the ideal in all conditions for if you want to really pull off a strategy. So in terms of permutations, the medium will be showing up pretty much every single time, and there'll be plenty more of them since there isn't a sprint weekend, and where in SQ1 and SQ2 they are mandatory. So I think if anyone's going to do a two-stop, it's going to be medium, hard. I don't think the soft tyre is going to get a look in on the Sunday. Either way, cooling and tyre warm-up will be really important here. Downforce may be as less significant. We will see whether or not Red Bull actually brings a front wing to the party. If they don't, then it isn't. I mean, if they do bring it, then I would expect Max to walk this. And in regards to who can score in the bottom half of the points, Hamilton's racecraft plus Ferrari's recent step on balance suggests a calm, low-drama run. I don't think he'll broach the top 5. He's been clear that the SF25 still has a lot of work to do, and they really couldn't explain why they were so quick around Austin. But I do feel like he could be in contention for 5th place, but ultimately lose out by a smidge to the person I will predict in a moment. I think then George Russell will be in for P7 because we all thought that Austin might have been a bit of a turning point for the W16, but it turned out not to be the case. And there are other teams which are a little bit more consistent in terms of this temperature. Yes, the temperatures are expected to be around 25, 26 for the weekend, a lot cooler than it was in Austin, but it might be still that little bit too hot for George to be contesting for the podium. But I'm thinking he will certainly score a solid bunch of points, since he did have a relatively anonymous time of it around Austin with a 6th place. Now, okay, Sainz I think will score some points, but I don't think it's going to be anything higher than 8th. I think that will be the limit. It really depends on what happens in qualifying, but you've got to remember, he was a tour de force around this circuit last year where he won the damn thing. So if he can qualify well and get into Q3, and then ideally somewhere 6th, so he's just outside the points, he might be able to find some fight back into the points because Williams know they have to be a little bit more aggressive, so I do think they'll be a lot bolder in terms of strategy and setup. That might be just the ticket, with Alex qualifying that little bit further to be a safer bet in terms of pointage. Tsunoda's ceiling depends on whether or not the execution at the start that we saw in Austin is something that's transferable, and how comfortable he is with the brake temperatures and clean air. Also, he has certainly benefited from the upgrade surge from Red Bull, so I do think that with that extra discipline he's shown and his conduct under pressure, this might be a ticket to score points, and ideally that the Racing Bulls do not score. And then I would expect Fernando Alonso to put in a cheeky point. He did it around the United States Grand Prix, so I'm expecting a similar thing. But you're probably wanting to know who I picked for the top 5. My predictions are forthcoming. Here they are. Now in 5th place, I'm going for a bit of a bold pick, and I am predicting that it will be Alex Albon. Now, come on, Law. Is this really that bold considering Williams has passed? Well, I do think so, and I do think he will have enough in the tank to keep himself ahead of the Ferrari since, well, he's done that before this season. Twice, I think. And you got to remember that this is going to be a Williams going down one of the longest straights on the calendar, and the place where they actually, I think, still hold the speed record in terms of the fastest speeds we've seen in an actual race. And sure, the Williams car nowadays is slightly less straight line coded than it was in previous years, but that's simply down to the fact that it actually has downforce. And besides, Alex has got a very big point to prove after really being humbled in the sprint by Carlos, and then Carlos dropping the ball in terms of the race itself, the Grand Prix. And Alex was very much out of position. This is something he'll want to rectify just a few days after that particular weekend. And also, Albon, in a situation where there might be a little bit of jeopardy, could absolutely thrive. You've got to remember, he did score here, I think, in 2023, and that was with a car that was objectively worse than the FW47. So if he's got a little bit more juice in terms of grip, then it might be enough for him to get that little bit higher and get at least another 10 points. At this point, I think it's a dead cert that Williams are going to be 5th in the Constructors, but I'm pretty sure they would like to get that little bit more in terms of pointage just for bragging rights, and to show that they are really going to be a force to be reckoned with next year. So I think that Albon will qualify in Q3. I think he'll be probably on like the 4th row or something, and then maybe make up the difference picking up a few people ahead of him, especially if a front runner stumbles, which I do think could happen. And I do think that with Alex being really kind to his tyres in situations like this, that he will probably go against the 2-stop plan and go for a simple 1-stop. But hang on, Lord, no. What are you thinking? That was the thing that was his undoing around Austin. Well, like I said earlier, this is the C2 tyre. The C1 tyre is nowhere to be found here. I don't think this is going to be easy for Alex to pull off, and like I mentioned, Lewis will probably give him a really hard time, so if he does end up in the top 5, it will be really well fought, especially since Sainz needs a miracle to get anywhere near him given his penalty. Then in 4th place, I have got Oscar Piastri. What? Really? Law, you're putting him down this low? He's got a championship to fight for. You see, that's the point, and I think that risk calculus is very much going to be carrying through until the point where it gets into the single figures, and so far that has not happened yet, but he cannot be thinking about this anymore. But if he's able to think that qualifying could be rectified, and he can qualify that little bit higher, then expect my prediction to be wrong. But at this point in time, I really cannot justify Oscar being anywhere higher because of his previous 2 outings getting no higher than P8. Sure, qualifying was an element in all of this last time out with track limits, and then inexperience was down to in 2023. But it just really means that I can't be absolutely delusional here and think that he's going to be storming the podium simply because, well, he's my boy. No, I think 4th place is relatively rational, and he's also not insistent in demanding special treatment. He might get a little bit of benefit in qualifying, but I don't think it's really going to be that beneficial. And the McLaren right now is all over the place. The downforce isn't as high as it used to be back in the day, or at least other teams have caught up. Its kindness to tyres was evident that it wasn't as forgiving as in the beginning of the year, because Piastri reported graining on the front left, which is very unusual for the 39. And I think that we are going to be seeing a Piastri that will be really, really patient, like we saw in the United States Grand Prix, but that ultimately meaning that he was just sitting tight in P5, hoping for chaos or a safety car. But it didn't happen. And considering how Lando was really coming on song last year, I really expect him to be doing something similar, and Piastri to be the slower of the two. And I think Oscar will probably be hoping that since Lando's got a lot more to fight for in keeping Max behind him and close in on him even further, that he might just take a few more risks, whereas Oscar can maybe afford to just allow things ahead of him to play out. It could be a podium, it depends whether or not the Ferraris actually show up here, given how suddenly they were back on song around Austin. And I think based on that assumption, and given his previous form, Charles Leclerc will most likely get his 3rd P3 in a row. He got it in 2023, in 2024, and I'm expecting him to do the same again here. He has been trending upwards over the years in terms of his pace, and I do think he is a good shout for a podium place. You know, despite this year's Ferrari having moments of brilliance and then moments of absolute mediocrity. But the problem is, though, is that brake temperatures are really important and the thin air can be a real factor here. I recall throughout qualifying in recent times that temperature was really a factor, and it got so much of a factor is that an errant cloud bringing the temperature down around a patch of track by a couple of degrees was the difference between the Ferrari not being on pole and potentially being on pole. It's that granular, people up here. The weather really plays a factor. Also, Ferrari has been known to really open up the fins and inlets for cooling, so we really do have to look at the engine cover that the SF25 is wielding for this particular event. If there are lots of holes, then expect his fight for a 3rd podium in a row to be that little bit more tricky. And when it comes to mindset, Charles is looking at a real situation where he was going from feeling absolutely powerless to being very much in control, channeling similar energy to what we saw back at the beginning of the season, where around Bahrain, he was able to keep Lando behind him for a good long while. But I don't expect Leclerc to be doing the same thing as he did around Austin and starting on the C5 tyres and hoping to blast past anyone at pole, because sure, he was able to elongate the C4s that little bit longer around the American track, but I really think he'll be thinking about more conservative strategy to make the most of potentially a fairly decent grid position. And if he's able to actually get into the top 3, or better yet on the front row, he might be able to do a little bit of tyre management and be able to be a real thorn in the McLaren side and maybe help out Piastri in keeping Lando behind him. But for right now, based on what we've had at the moment, I'm expecting him to finish behind the 2nd place man, Lando Norris. And I say this because, like with Leclerc, Lando's form has ticked upwards from barely being able to get into the points to a 2nd place, just a few seconds behind Carlos this time last year. I expect him to just repeat the same thing, provided he doesn't get into any element of heroics or he has a really bad start, as we saw in Austin twice. But at the same time, his headspace is really clear. He has whittled down, once again, the advantage that Piastri has over him to just 14 points. And better yet, if Oscar has a real mardy of a situation where he barely scores points or doesn't score points at all, there is an opportunity that if Lando's on the podium, he can take back the lead of the championship. There are opportunities opportunities here for him to really turn things around and stop McLaren from intervening in any potential battle. It might be just down to them. But that being said, the thin air could potentially really reduce the strengths that we've come to know from the McLaren. But I do think the tyres will be a little bit more forgiving. The degradation around this circuit isn't as bad as it around Austin. And we are bringing in a C2, so we could see a medium-hard situation, or if Lando wants to be a bit frisky and push a little harder, maybe go for a two-stopper, but it's a little bit 50-50 at the moment. But I do think the realistic scenario is that he's just going to shadow Verstappen. He's going to try and keep P2, make sure no one else takes it, unlike Leclerc last time out, and just try and get that little bit closer to Piastri, who might be a little bit weaker. If it turns out to be second and fourth, that's still 6 more points toward the Brit. That he will take with still 4 weekends to go. It'll be down to single figures. He's thinking about risk calculus 2 now. And besides, right now, they would ideally like it that Lando has a clear advantage, McLaren, and to not bring any drama their way whatsoever. You know, just a couple of calm weekends where the drivers don't get involved with each other at all. And I do think that is going to be the case. And another thing that's going to be the case is that Max Verstappen is going to win the Mexico City Grand Prix again, because, come on, Red Bull is pouring everything into the RB21, and Max's record around this circuit is ridiculous. He has won here a total of 5 times, and there is a very just cause for him to make it 6. His focus right now has very much hardened, has become very, very serious. It's nothing like the dismissiveness that we saw at the beginning of the year, and I'm betting he's really ruining that situation around the Spanish Grand Prix, where he banged into Russell and he lost so many points because of it. That would easily make the situation even spicier than it is right now, within just 40 points behind the Australian and 26 behind Norris. And I do think Red Bull are going to be employing a similar strategy to what they did for qualifying around Silverstone and around Monza. They are probably going to go extra skinny and hope for the best that Verstappen is able to make up the difference in the technical stuff around the low-speed corners, which worked so well around Monza. There is little pressure for him to be had because, as he said many times at this point, anything after the first World Championship he had is a bonus. He'd really like to have a 5th one, but even now, with him just being in contention and more people taking it seriously, this is really much validating the justification, because the cheering that we got when he stepped up on the top spot around Austin is a far cry from what it was just a couple of years ago, when people were booing and jeering and cursing his name. We weren't getting that anymore. And I think if he's able to get pole or the front row, then he's basically got it. I think he'll be able to just do the same thing he always does. I'm not going to say it because I've done it so many times. Dictate the pace and move on. And I really don't see any evidence that Red Bull's going to struggle around here, because they really dialed in what is expected around the circuit. You know, the altitude, the demands of the car, the strenuousness of it all, and the fact that, well, they got a Max. So I'm really thinking that this is going to be yet another win for the guy. And I have evidence to suggest that you'll like this video right here. I'll see you over there with a slightly different article of clothing.